So it's Ki Teise. Many commandments in this parsha. Covers all areas of life, and it's the parsha with the most commandments in it. So, as is our custom, we'll share the screen and begin with the parsha in a nutshell. Can figure out how to do this. Okay. 74 of the Torah's 613 commandments are in the parsha of Ki Teise. So that's a very big percentage. What exactly the percentage? I don't know. We'll check it up after. In any case, these includes the laws of the beautiful captive, the inheritance rights of the firstborn, the wayward and rebellious son, burial and dignity of the dead, returning a lost object, sending away the mother bird before taking her young, the duty to erect a safety fence around the roof of one's home, and the various forms of kilayim, forbidden plants, and animal hybrids. So there are certain plants that you can't plant together, and also certain animals that you can not only breed together, for sure not, but even have them work together. So we can talk about that. Also recounted are the judicial procedures and penalties for adultery, for the rape or seduction of an unmarried girl, and for a husband who falsely accuses his wife of infidelity. The following cannot marry a person of Jewish lineage: a mamzer, someone born from an adulterous or incestuous relationship, a male of Moabite or Ammonite descent, a first or second generation Edomite or Egyptian. Our parsha also includes laws governing the purity of the military camp, the prohibition against returning an escaped slave, the duty to pay a worker on time, and to allow anyone working for you, man or animal, to eat on the job. The proper treatment of a debtor, and the prohibition against charging interest on a loan, the laws of divorce, from which are also derived many of the laws of marriage, the penalty of 39 lashes for transgression of a Torah prohibition, and the procedures of yibum, levirate marriage of the wife of a deceased childless brother, or chalitza, removing of the shoe, in the case that the brother-in-law does not wish to marry her. Ki Teise concludes with the obligation to remember what Amalek did to you on the road on your way out of Egypt. It's Deuteronomy, so don't be surprised to find repetition. It's repeating of the Torah, Mishnah Torah, the second Torah, Deuteronomy, right? So it's Greek for two, do. And the idea is that some of the things that are repeated, and indeed the commandment to remember Amalek is repeated. So this is just some of the 17 of the what did we say? 74 commandments. And of course, there's a lot to say and a lot to start with. And that's the question, where to start from? And the answer is, unless somebody has a preference, we start from the beginning, and then we see where we end up. Please. Ki Teise. So it's Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 10. In the art scroll, it is page 1046. Thank you. That's why it's good to be in person.
Yeah.
No, not though. That's not why. That's one of the perks. Okay, so just an introduction. I would say that the beginning of the parsha has some very strange portions for the modern ear, and they sound very, terrible to the modern ear. They sound very, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? They don't sound too moral. So we have to read it carefully. We have to read it with a look to what was happening at the time and comparing it to what was happening at the time. And of course, we can also look at the mystical interpretation, because we have that as well. So that's just the beginning, certainly the beginning portions. We should do that.
Ki Teise.
Ki Teise, yeah.
This says Teitze. Am I on the wrong one?
No, that's it. Ki Teise. Yeah, they spell. There's no way to spell Te. Is there? Teise. The tzaddik is a tricky word, tricky letter in English. You have some people do TZ, some people do, who knows, IES, all kinds of things. Okay, so I'm just going to mention, even before we get to the second verse of the parsha, which is where we get to the captive woman, which is like I said, it says it's not such a simple parsha to relate to. But for a moment, let's look at the first verse. We're going to war. And why is this so interesting? So let's share the screen. This week's parsha, share the screen. So verse 1, right? We start with verse 1 of the parsha, verse 10. Oh, it's interesting. If you go out to war against your enemies. Now, I said it's the first verse of the parsha. We know the division of the chapters is different because it starts as Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 10. Who starts a parsha with chapter 10? With verse 10. Why would you start a chapter? Why would you start a parsha 10 verses into a chapter? So the answer is that the division of the chapters is not a Jewish division. In the Middle Ages, the Christians divided. There was a priest, I forget his name, who divided the parsha, the chapters. The Jews only adapted those chapters for convenience because they had to debate the Christians, so they would refer to certain chapters as certain chapters. But in the Torah, originally there are no chapters. So the fact that the person sitting here saying this beginning of this parsha is verse 10 tells you that logically this is a continuation to before, and it leads to the question: so why do we start a new parsha here? Now, to defend the division of the chapters, yes. If when you go out to war against your enemies, that's not the beginning of the story of war. You turn back in the Torah, last week's parsha was all about going to war, right? If you want to talk about last week's parsha, going back to if you have the article, page 1041, even before, 1038, chapter 20 is the parsha is about war. When you go out to battle against your enemy. It talks about how to prepare for war. That's from chapter 20, verse 1 to verse 10. And then how to wage war. Page 1041, verse 10. Chapter 20, verse 10. When you draw near to a city to wage war against it, what should you do? Who should you live? Who should you let live? Who should you kill? Preservation of fruit trees. Page 1043, verse 19. Kitasur al-ir. When you besiege a city for many days to war against it to seize it, do not destroy its trees by swinging an axe against them, etc. So you can't just have utter destruction, which is what armies like to do. Because if you don't want to have any trouble with resurgence, what you do is you just destroy the place, right? The march to the sea in the Civil War. What you want to do is that's the logical thing to do. The Torah says, no, you don't do that, you don't destroy. Okay, so we had many, many verses. The entire chapter 20 was about war. And then we talk about dead people, what that's fitted. If you find a corpse, that could also be related to war. And then you get to this week's parsha, when you will go out to war against your enemies. Okay, fine. So it seems like it's a continuation to the laws of war, which it is. But somehow or another, the Torah puts it as a new parsha, or at least whoever divided the parsha proportions. I'm not exactly sure who did, but it's certainly a Jewish source. It certainly predates the division of the chapters. Say, no. This is not last parsha. This is a new parsha. So why is it a new parsha? So that's the question. So before we get to the answer, let's read the parsha. Sounds like a strange parsha to the modern ear, but we're going to read it anyway because we're brave.
So the books are Jewish. The 5 books.
The 5 books of Moses are Jewish because you open up the Torah, you will see that between each of the 5 books, there's 4 blank lines. So that's a division that we got the Torah scroll as it is. It's a copy from the way Moshe handed it to us. You also have what is Jewish and must be the same. This goes all the way back to Moses. And if you make it, if you don't preserve this, the Torah scroll is invalid, is the paragraph break. This chumash, the art scroll, is a good chumash in the sense that it preserves the paragraph breaks. If you're looking at page 1046, paragraph break. Look at 1040, it's all paragraph breaks. Without getting into it right now, we discussed it another times. On 1050, you see there's 2 types of paragraph breaks, what they call ptucha stuma, open or closed. On 1050, if you look at the second line, there's one form of paragraph break where the break is surrounded by text on both sides. That's called a stuma, it's closed. Then you have a ptucha, the next line, page 1050, line 4. It's open in the sense that the paragraph break is not surrounded by text on both sides, and the new paragraph starts at a new line. And this is significant. If you don't make the right paragraph break, or if you make open instead of close instead of open, in other words, you don't do the same form of paragraph break that the Torah does, the Torah scroll is invalid. Now, what's the difference between the 2 types of paragraph breaks? So paragraph break is a separation, But if the new paragraph starts on the same line as the old one, like line 2 of 1050, then it's a new section, but it's still related. It's the same line. But if you look at page 1050, line 4 in the Hebrew, the new paragraph, the break goes to the end of the line. New paragraph starts on the next line. That's more of a division between the old paragraph and the new paragraph. So even in between a new paragraph, how related is the new to the old? So if it's stuma, if it's closed, then it's more related. If it's ptucha, if it's open, then it's not. So that's from the Torah, and that's precise. The division of the parshas, I don't know exactly when the parshas were division. It wasn't always universal the way we do it now. We divide the Torah into the 1 year, into 53. Sometimes some communities, they divide it into 3 years. In Talmudic times, in Talmudic times, about 1,000 years ago, it becomes a universal custom to read the way we do, finish the Torah in a year. So that's a Jewish source. But it doesn't go, I doubt it goes back to Moshe. I don't know. But the chapters certainly don't. And now you see, it's actually an interesting.
Well, it must.
What does? The Parsha division?
Goes back to Moses.
Okay.
The way the Rebbe here says it. Moses told the Jewish people. Moses.
Yeah, no, for sure. Moshe said,
Moses
for
told the
sure,
Jewish
for
people.
sure. Every word in the Torah comes from Moses, for sure.
Good interjector here.
Yeah, there's no question that Moses, the Torah,
The level of Rabbi Feldman is about 50 years.
you have the cheat book. It's not fair. You're
I
looking
will
at,
make it 50 years from now and you're 90.
not fair. You're gonna put me out of a job. You're gonna put me out of,
138,
you're gonna put me out of a job.
138, maybe will be 50.
Okay, so what am I saying here? What am I saying? I'm saying that I understand why you would say, yeah, beginning of this parsha, beginning of this parsha, page 1046 is about the war, so it's continuation. But we're going to say, from the Jewish perspective, it's a new parsha, and we'll show you why. And this just shows you how you're supposed to read the Torah carefully. So I'm just going to read the parsha, the first paragraph inside. Trigger alert, this may trigger you. Trigger warning, if you need to take a break, come back in a few minutes, you can do that. Here we go. If you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God will deliver him into your hands, and you take his captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire her, you may take her to yourself, take her for yourself as a wife. You shall bring her into your home, and she shall shave her head and let her nails grow. She shall remove the garment of her captivity from upon herself and stay in your house and weep for her father and for her mother for a full month. After that, you may be intimate with her and possess her, and she will be a wife for you. And it will be, if you do not desire her, then you shall send her away wherever she wishes, but you shall not sell her for money. You shall not keep her as a servant because you have afflicted her. That's the first paragraph, verse 10 to verse 14. Now, if you like it, these verses, if you don't, we'll discuss that in a minute. But before, let's differentiate between this and the previous parsha. Previous parsha, Shoftim, judges, we discussed institutions. We discussed the institution of the court. We discussed the institution of the monarchy. We discussed the institution of the prophet, what it takes to be a prophet. We discussed the institution of war. How do you go to war? This is all collective. To be a nation, you need a judiciary, you need an executive, you need a moral voice, which is the prophet. You need to know how to go to war. These are what we would call the klal, the general. It's not about the individual person. You're not thinking about necessarily the individual person. You're thinking about the collective. Teise, so this is how to be a moral country, is last week's parsha. This week's parsha, how to be a moral person. Okay, it's very different. It's different. And therefore, even though there's some overlap, because war is a function of the state, you don't go to war on your own. And that's why the entire chapter 20 about war is last week's parsha, right? So yes, you also, so there is the aspect of war, which is the function of the state, and how to do that morally. And that's last week's parsha. Okay, this week's parsha, we come back to war, but it's a different war. It's a different question. It's not a question of war policy for the collective, but it's the individual. How does an individual person behave in war? And therefore, if you look at the entire parsha, part of the parsha talks about, is always focused on the individual. And if you look at a lot of the portions here, we always focus on the individual. And therefore, also the person the Torah is trying to protect here, which we will see, is also the captive woman. The emphasis is on the woman, on the individual person. Last week, we weren't doing that. Last week, we were saying which nation you could go to war with, which nation you can't, which nation you kill, which nation you don't. Nations. Here, we're talking about individuals. If you want to look at the end of the parsha, Amalek, It's very interesting because one of the ways where you see with the Torah, what the Torah is trying to emphasize is by looking at two portions where the Torah seems to be saying the same thing, and then looking at the subtle differences. And the subtle differences, when examined, are not so subtle. So when you see something is similar, then the differentiations, then you realize how the differentiations are so critical. So you look at the story of Amalek in Exodus, where the story happens. There it talks about Amalek is terrible. We have to go to war with him. Why? Because he battled God. He wasn't afraid of God. We were God's chosen people. God took us out of Egypt. Amalek said, I'm not afraid of God. I'm going to war with Amalek, with the Jewish people. We have to remember that. God will never forget Amalek. Blot out his name. What does it say in this week's Parsha? Blot out Amalek's name. Why? Because he went after you and attacked the weak people amongst you. Not the story of he's going against a nation.
God will
It
blot
goes
out
both ways.
Amalek,
It goes both
but,
ways. It
uh,
goes
we-
both ways. It goes both ways. There's two different parshas. It goes both ways. Let's talk about that. Let's take a peek. That's a good point that you're focusing in on. Timcha. Here it says you shall. In the Exodus, it says God will. So there's some evil that God eradicates, some evil you eradicate. But here, the emphasis is, if you want to look at the end of the Parsha, 1067, if you're interested, remember what Amalek did to you on the way when you were leaving Egypt, that he happened upon you on the way and he struck those of you who were hindmost in the back. But what it means, all the weakenings at your rear when you were faint and exhausted, and he did not fear God. Okay, Amalek didn't fear God. But what's the problem? What are we saying? What's so terrible about Amalek? That he's battled God? No, that he struck the weak. In other words, this parsha tells the individual how to protect the individual person, whether she is a captive from a different culture and nationality, or it's the Amalek, we're upset at Amalek for attacking the weak Jew. So what I'm trying to say here is that many of the ideas that were said earlier in the Torah are reiterated here from the perspective of the individual. And that's why it's a new parsha, because the laws of war are not the laws of war. We're not talking about, in other words, it's not the same laws of war as last parsha. Last parsha, we're talking about how the nation goes to war. This parsha talks about how does the individual treat other people in war. So it's a different story, and therefore it's its own parsha. So don't feel bad when you open up the new parsha and you see that it's verse 10, which implies that at least some people believed that logically it belongs in last parsha. It's a continuation of last parsha. No, it's not. It's a new parsha. And just because the guy who never went to a Jewish Torah class and he missed the boat, he said, oh, war, it's a continuation to before. No, that guy was out to lunch. We have it right, in case you were worried. Okay, I don't know what to talk about. Let's talk about the first parsha. Those verses that we read, are they good? Are they bad? Are they moral? Are they immoral? In one hand, to the modern ear, it sounds very, very primitive and very taking advantage of this poor captive woman. Here, you go to war, you capture somebody, and you could take her home and marry her. How terrible, right? So maybe it will be considered a war crime today. I don't know.
You want to hear the insight in this or not yet?
I want to hear it in a minute. You want to give me the mystical? I want to give you the practical. I want to hear the mystical in a minute. Before we do the mystical, I'm going to say the practical. Practically speaking, also it's a good thing. So practically speaking, what the Talmud says is as follows. Talmud says that this is one example of the Torah, where the Torah, in the language of the Talmud, lo dibra Torah ela keneged yetzer hara. The Torah is talking to the evil inclination, meaning to say, the Torah is not telling you doesn't always tell you what the best thing is. Torah is not only a book that looks at the world from the ideal perspective. That's not practical. Torah is a practical book. Torah knows that there's a human being, and a human being has human emotion and has weaknesses. And Torah takes that into account. And this portion, there are others, but this one specifically, this is what Talmud says, specifically, the Torah is addressing the evil inclination, meaning to say, if you say, person in war, again, war doesn't mean war, it means that you're very distant from family. When you go out of your society, you don't have sort of the community and the society to protect your morals. You're on your own. It allows for the animalistic side of man to emerge, especially with his war. So the Torah believes that if you say you cannot marry this woman, people won't listen. So what does the Torah do? The Torah says, oh, you could marry her. There is a path to marry her, but we just have to go through all this regulation. What's regulation number one? Wait a month. Bring her to your house. Wait a month. Bring her to your house means you're bringing her back to civilization, to where you live. You bring her back to your family. And all of a sudden, she's sitting and crying for a month. All of a sudden, she's not that exotic and it's not that exciting because a month passed. And the context of where you were when you were alone in the field is one story. And you're coming back, bringing her to your life. I don't suggest it's not such a great idea. In other words, when you bring that woman home, it may not be so easy, right? So the point here, what I'm trying to say is the Torah says, instead of saying no, and then Torah understands some people will disregard it. Torah says, yes, it's okay. But here is the path to do it in a proper way. And that's the practical thing. That's what we're doing here. And what the Torah's real point here is, the Torah doesn't really believe that you're going to marry her. You only wanted to marry her because it was the lust of the moment. But if she's sitting here and then you treat her as an individual, you let her cry for her parents, a lot of the lust disappears. So what happens? The Torah right away says, "V'haya," and it will be, not if, and it will be. In other words, it's very likely that you're not going to want to marry her. Verse 14, it will be if you do not desire her. It will be if, very likely. So what's the key here? The key here is then you shall send her away wherever she wishes, but you shall not sell her for money. You shall not keep her as a servant because you have afflicted her. That's what the Torah is trying to get at. The Torah is trying to say, can't take advantage of the person. You want to marry her? Fine, you can marry her under these conditions. Okay. They make it harder psychologically, it makes it harder for it to happen. And if you don't want to marry her, which is very likely, okay, the key here is you afflicted her, you captured her, so therefore you can't sell her, you have to set her free. What we're doing here is, again, even if to the modern ear, this sounds very primitive and very immoral, but from the Torah's perspective, where the Torah is coming from, what we're doing here is understanding the realities of what war is, understanding the culture that we are approaching, and instead of outlawing, which doesn't always work, you find a way to make it unlikely, and then you do what you really want to do is to protect the woman that she may not be sold. So that is the simple interpretation. Seth wants to give. If you don't do it, I'll do it. So that's a threat. There are many interpretations, spiritual interpretations of what this means, and what the spiritual interpretation of what this means. We have at least two ways we can go. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we have at least two ways we can go. Hopefully Seth will give us one and I'll give the other, right? No pressure. Okay, there's two ways. Go ahead, no pressure, only if you want. Everything in Torah has to be understood on multiple planes, and we're talking about there are different ways of studying this, and we also seek to study the mystical, not just the practical. So from the mystical perspective, there's two ways to do this. One, it was written by others as well, but is the Or HaChaim. Or HaChaim was a great Sephardic sage who lived in the 1700s, a little bit before the revelation of the Hasidic teachings, but many of the Hasidic teachings were influenced by the Or HaChaim. In other words, many of the Hasidic Rebbes quote the Or HaChaim all the time. So he's very mystical. And he basically says like this: you go to war and you see in the captive a beautiful woman and you want her. What does that tell you? What does that mean? Says the Or HaChaim, a beautiful concept. He says, it so happens to be that there are sparks, Jewish souls, that for whatever reason, the Kabbalists give the reason, whatever, give some interpretations. For whatever reason, there are Jewish souls that are born as non-Jews, and their spiritual path is to come and convert. And this is a very interesting concept because in Talmudic literature, this idea was spelled out recently, but the source of the idea, in other words, you see it's rooted in Talmudic literature, discusses cases where somebody is not obligated in the law and then becomes obligated in the law. What are the examples? So the classic example is Katan Shehigdil, a child who matured. So I'm 12, I'm not obligated, or I'm a woman, I'm 11, I'm not obligated. I turn 12 or 13, I'm obligated. And there are all kinds of interesting questions. For example, what's a good question? A good question is there's a commandment to count 49 days from Passover to Shavuot, to count 49 days. A child is not obligated. An adult is obligated. What happens if I mature, if I become 13 or 12, in between Passover and Shavuot? So till day 20, I didn't have to count. From day 21, I do have to count. So what's the second half? Do I have to count it? This makes no sense. How do you count it? So these are questions. Another question. You have to bring the second Passover if you did not bring the first Passover. What happens if I wasn't bar bat mitzvah on the first Passover, but I do become bar bat mitzvah the second Passover? So do I have to bring a second Passover? This is fascinating. If the second Passover is a holiday for itself, then you do have to. If it's just fulfilling for the first, then you don't, because I wasn't obligated into the first. There's all kinds of halachic questions that happen when somebody shifts from not being obligated to being obligated. Why am I telling this to you? Because one example is katan shehigdil, a child who mature. Another example is ger shenitgayer, a convert who converted. I converted between Passover and Shavuot. Yesterday I didn't have to count the Omer. Today I do. So when you have to count, today's the day 22. No, you have to count 1-1. It's an individual obligation. So again, part of these questions. And that in the Talmud, they go together. Katan she'igdil, child who matured, a convert who converted. Fine. So we've been discussing this for 3,000 years. I think it was the 19th century. There's a commentary. I don't remember who says it the first one, but I think it's relatively recent. And he says, 1 second, stop. Everybody stop. Everybody take it easy. What is with the grammar here? It's inconsistent. If you say a child who matured, you don't say an adult who matured, because he was a child, then he matured. Child who matured. How would you say someone who converted? You say a Gentile who converted. Child who matured, a Gentile who converted. We don't say that. What do we say? A convert who converted. Why do you say a convert who converted? It's like you don't say an adult who became an adult. You don't talk about the state he is in now.
They converted until they converted.
Right. So say he was a child, so a Gentile who converted.
Right.
So why do we say in the Talmud, we say a child, in the Talmudic literature, we say a child who matured and a convert who converted? If you're talking about the transition from one state to the other, just like you say, go ahead.
Well, it's a natural, a convert was probably thinking about it.
But a child also, but
A child, we knew eventually was the same thing. They were eventually going to get to the point where they had to take the
right. And nevertheless, we say a child who matured. So say a Gentile who converted. Nothing wrong with being a Gentile. There's 7 billion of them. There's nothing wrong. It's not
The
offensive.
neshama was already Jewish.
I'm sorry?
The neshama was already Jewish.
So what the sages say is they were always a convert. They were always a convert. They didn't become a convert when they converted. When they converted, you discover they were always a convert. With a child, it's not that way. When I become 13, it doesn't mean I wasn't a child, right? I become 13, now I'm 13, now I'm obligated, but I had 13 years. I had 12 full years that I was not obligated. So you're gonna say, you can't say an adult who matured. I wasn't an adult before. I'm an adult now, but I wasn't an adult before. But a convert who converted, my soul was always a convert. So what are you gonna say, a Gentile? I wasn't a Gentile, I was a convert. That's the perspective of Judaism, says the Orach Chaim. If you go and you go into war, when you're righteous, how are you righteous? Because last parsha we say whoever was afraid of sins didn't go to war. We sent them home. So you're righteous. If a Jew wants something, if you desire this woman, it's very likely that she has a Jewish spark, and you're going to bring her home to your house. She's going to convert, and you marry her. It says in the Talmud that when it says she'll cry for her father and mother, it's also a metaphor for idol worship. Because in Isaiah talks about, they tell the idol worshippers, tell the being, you say, you're my father. Father is to give birth to me. So the point here is, she's also to marry you, she also has to give up her idol worship. If she wants to, if she doesn't want to, then you can't marry her. The point here is that this is the process of conversion. Says the Orach Chaim, if I want something, if I'm drawn to something, it's because it's very likely it's because that person has a Jewish soul that has to come back. So that's one way of reading this whole story. Then you have more mystical. I suspect that's what, because I see which books you're reading, I suspect this is what this is the influence that they have on you, I suspect. And that is that we're talking about the inner spiritual battle. And the inner spiritual battle we go to war is we go to war. We go to war to within ourselves, the positivity and negativity within ourselves. Who's the woman of beautiful form? That's what it says. You'll see amongst the captive a woman who is a beautiful form. So the Kabbalists say, Hasidic philosophy elaborates upon this, that's the soul. The soul is in captivity. Within who? Within the consciousness of the animal soul. And what you're trying to do here is you're trying to bring you back to the soul, the marriage between the conscious mind and the soul. And that's a process that takes time. She has to cry for her father and mother for 30 days. Arizal says 30 days is Elul, 30 days before Rosh Hashanah. That's the process of redeeming the captivity. She was captive. She was so you see amongst the captive a captive woman, right? She was captive, meaning the soul was taken captive by the consciousness of the animal soul, and you're bringing this together. But again, these are the mystical ways of reading it, and there's so many layers to that. But there's also the practical, and the practical is Torah is also a practical book. And sometimes we say that something is permitted, not because we want you to do it, but because we don't want you to do it. And we understand that if we say no, you may not listen. If we say yes, but then yeah, 30 days, come back in 30 days. You know, you just destroyed all the excitement and all the fun. Bring her back to your house. Oh my God, that's not going to go over well. Bring her back to, remember, you bring her back to your house. You have your society, you're going to shul. People are going to ask you what you're doing, right? People don't behave the same way when they're far from their friends, when they're far from their moral support system than the way they are when they are home. That's just the way it is. All right, that's what they say. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. The point is, I'm away from my normal society. Then my standards also are much more compromised. So you say, no problem, marry her, no problem, just take her home for a month. Okay, very good. So that's what there is to say. A lot more to say, but at least that's to touch upon. Just to get in and out of the first portion takes 40 minutes because it's such a difficult portion. Then we get to the other portions. We have all kinds of portions here that have to be dealt with, especially the third one, the wayward son. I don't know if you want to deal with that. We probably discussed it in the past, but I want to go to a little further, chapter 22. If you want to go back to the wayward son after, I want to talk about a little bit about this returning the lost object. And then if anybody has any preference to speak about any specific mitzvah, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, we'll see where we end up because again, it's the mystery. They tell the story about the Baal Shem Tov, that the Baal Shem Tov would travel to all kinds of, every now and then, every Saturday night, he would get onto the horse and wagon, he would travel, and he would end up somewhere. And when he ended up in that town, he knew that there's something for him to do. He'd walk around, find a guy who needs help and help him, and then go home, right? All the 70% of the Baal Shem Tov stories go the same way. That's Baal Shem Tov and his students, they got into the wagon and they drove off. The story is that he had a wagon driver, the Baal Shem Tov. And the wagon driver, I think his name was Alexei or something like that. And the story is told that what they would do is he would hit the horses, then he would fall asleep. And that's how they knew they're ending up where they need to be. Because if you're directed, then it's your consciousness. But the Baal Shem Tov's, the wagon driver would fall asleep and end up where you end up with. And that's how they knew that it's by divine providence. So we too, when we start, we have no idea where we end up. So we're following the Baal Shem Tov's horses. Wherever we end up, we end up. And that's the story. Okay, so I'm sharing the screen going to the same parsha, second parsha, chapter 22, on the art scroll at page 1049, verse 22. Famous mitzvah to return the lost object. But I want to deal with one or two verses here that are very interesting, and they probably touch upon the theme of the entire parsha. Let's see what happens. Deuteronomy chapter 22. You shall not see your brother's ox or sheep straying and ignore them. Rather, you shall return them to your brother. But if your brother is not near you, or if you do not know him, you shall bring it into your house, and it shall be. And it shall be with you until your brother seeks it out, whereupon you shall return it to him. Right? So you're not allowed to ignore a lost object. If I see my friend's ox or sheep, I cannot ignore it, have to return it, but I don't know whose it is. He's not here. Either I know who it is, but he's not here, or I have no idea who it is. Bring it into your house until the guy seeks it out, and then you'll return it. Verse 3, so shall you do to his donkey, so shall you do with his garment, and so shall you do with any lost article of your brother, which he has lost and you have found. You shall not ignore it. What a terrible translation. Lo tuchal italem. They translate as you shall not ignore it. Okay, we'll get to that later. Verse 4, you shall not see your brother's donkey or his ox fallen under its load on the road and ignore them. Rather, you shall pick up his load with him. So basically, even if you're in a rush, you have to stop everything you do to return your brother's lost object, which is very, very radical, because what the Torah says usually is, in other words, we understand in the portion of, for example, in the portion of Mishpatim in the book of Exodus, we understand there's laws of torts. We understand that you're not allowed to harm your fellow. You can't cause somebody else to lose money. You can't damage your fellow. That is logical. But to say I have to stop my business to make sure my fellow doesn't lose something else, That's already a chidush. That's novelty. That's news. Why do I have to stop my day? I'm storing on Greenwich Avenue. Why do I have to stop my day? To make sure that you don't take a financial loss. I didn't cause the loss. It was your problem. But no, we say, stop what you're doing. Don't ignore it. Take in the sheep. Remember, it's not just picking up a wallet and calling the police station. Sometimes it's labor intensive. You have to take the animal in. Taking an animal in, it's not so simple to take an animal into your home. So that is what the commandment is saying, and it's a moral obligation, but sometimes it comes along with a lot of it's a difficult thing to do. Now, is there ever a case that you're allowed to ignore it? Right? That's the question. So in the Talmud, there's a whole chapter in Tractate Baba Metzia, talk about Elam Metzia. These are different lost objects, and there are basically, like everything else in the law, there are exceptions to the rule. I'm just trying to find it in the Talmud so I could share it with you. There are exceptions to the rule. One example. Says the Mishnah, if I find something, I'm a very respectful person. You're the judge in town. You're a distinguished person. And you find a package. And it's not respectful for you, for whatever reason, to pick up this package and schlep it down the avenue like you're a schlepper. It's not respectful. Talmud says in that case, you don't have to take it, you don't have to return it. You want to, you could, but you don't have to. What's the litmus test? The litmus test is, if I would not pick this up, if it was mine, then I don't have to pick it up if it was yours. Right? Sometimes I see it's not worth it for me. Below my dignity to schlep this. I'm a distinguished person. I'm an old man. It's hard for me. If I wouldn't do it for myself, I don't have to do it for the other. That's what the Talmud says. Now, where does the Talmud derive this from? Where do you see that in these verses? So it's a play on the word. We share the screen and we'll do the play on the word. In verse 1, chapter 22. So in the art scroll, it's page 1049, verse 1. You shall not see the ox, you shall not see your brother's ox or sheep straying and ignore them. Literally in the Hebrew, lo tireh, you shall not see. Shorachicha, your brother's ox, or etzayo, or a sheep, nidachin, being going astray. V'hi talamta mehem, and you shall ignore them. So the Talmud does something very funny. The Talmud says, you're going to read it a little differently. Read the verse. V'hi talamta mehem, you shall read. And ignore them. Look at the English. What does the English say? You shall not see your brother's ox or sheep straying, comma.
In this one, it says
Hide yourself from them. And hide yourself from them. Okay. Ignore it. Hitalamta means hitalem means to conceal yourself. But conceal yourself means make believe I didn't see it. Okay, let's do the English translation here. Shall not see the ox of your brother and the sheep will go cast off, comma. Shall not see it. Hide yourself from them. Hitalamta mehem, and hide yourself from them. It doesn't, if you read the full phrase, you understand that this positive is really a continuation to a negative. Right? Don't see your brother's ox going astray and ignore them. But you can read it, if you read this comma after the comma as a clause in itself, you shall not see your brother's ox. Semicolon, you're done. That's one clause. You ignore it. You can ignore it. You shall ignore it. Some cases you shall ignore it. Now go back to the end now continue down to verse number 3. The end of verse 3. Verse 3 says, you shall do, so shall you do for a donkey, so shall you do for his garment, and so shall you do for any lost article of your brother, that he may become lost from him, and you find it. You shall not hide yourself. Here, you shall not ignore, right? Here, it's clear that even if you read just this clause by itself, lo tuchal lehitalem, you cannot ignore. Previously, it says, v'hitalam tamehem, you will ignore them. Yeah, I understand. There it means don't. The don't is in the beginning of the sentence. But because the don't is so far removed, you could really break it up and say, verse 1 says, ignore them. Verse 3 says, don't ignore them. That's exactly what the Talmud says. The Talmud says, sometimes you follow verse 3, you don't ignore. And sometimes you follow verse 1, at least the way we're choosing to read it very narrowly, and you are allowed to ignore it. And what's the example? The example the Talmud says, for example, is zaken, if you're an old man and it's below your dignity to schlep it, then if you wouldn't do it for yourself, don't do it for the other person. So let me just share the Talmud for a second. Whoops. And again, like I said, it's illegal. I wouldn't call it a loophole, but it is illegal. It's not the simple meaning of the verse, but that's what we do. So if you look at, we're quoting the Mishnah here. The Mishnah teaches, if a person found a sack or a basket or any other item that it is not his typical manner to take and carry because it is beneath his dignity, he shall not take it. In other words, that's what the Mishnah says. If I find something that it's below my dignity, I don't take it. If it were mine, I wouldn't schlep it down the avenue. Then I don't have to. I'm not obligated to take it for somebody else. What's the source? The Gemara asks, from where are these matters derived? Like, where does the Mishnah pull this out of the hat from? Where's the biblical source? So the Gemara answers, it is as the sages taught in a Baraita. It is stated with regard to the return of a lost item, you shall not see your brother's ox or sheep wandering and disregard them, and you shall return them to your brother. The Tana explains that the phrase "and disregard them," we already have three translations. We have ignore, we have hide yourself, and we have disregard. So it's three English words for the same Hebrew word. But the bottom line is, it says, don't see your brother's ox and et cetera, or his donkey being lost. But then it says, and disregard them. So the Tana explains that the phrase "and disregard them" means that there are occasions in which you may disregard lost items, and there are occasions in which you may not disregard them.
It says, if your brother is not near you and you do not know him, then gather inside of each other. In other words, if it's too difficult.
Yeah. Then you don't have to.
Then, right, if you're no man, it's too difficult.
But what's the root? Where do you get that in the verses? I read this verse, I didn't see anything.
It says, if it's not near to you, then it's difficult.
No, then you have to. The verse says. Then you take it into your house and return it to him.
No, it doesn't say that.
I think it does, unless I'm
It
misreading.
shall remain with you until your brother inquires after it. That means
Yeah.
you keep it,
No,
but you don't have to make the effort. He
correct,
has to make.
correct, but you can't ignore it.
You're not ignoring it,
Right,
but you're not going out of your way to.
correct,
Strain
but you have to
yourself.
take it into your house and take care of it.
You're gonna wanna find him, because who wants to take a sheep forever?
No, but if it's too difficult.
But you have an no.
What do you
So
want the sheep?
let's be clear. The cases that Seth is addressing is verse 2. Verse 2 is, I did not ignore it. I picked it up, either an object or an animal. My brother, I don't know what my brother is. He's either distant, my fellow Jew is distant, or he's too far. So I don't have to chase him. You're right. I don't have to get onto a boat to Australia to return his ox, but I have to take it into my house and I have to hold it until he comes. And then I return to him. And like the end of verse 3 says, Lo tuchal italem, you shall not hide yourself. You shall not ignore it. You shall not disregard it.
Right.
But this with Talmud is saying something much more different. The Talmud is saying some cases you don't even have to pick it up. And we have a whole list of cases. We'll get to that in a second. The whole list of cases. Now, where do you get that from? So the Talmud, it says, look, the Torah uses a phrase that could be read. If you ignore the beginning of the clause, so you want to separate the two clauses, you can read it in a way. In the beginning of verse 1, you shall ignore them. Says the Talmud, sometimes you could ignore it. Which cases? For example, I'm back on the Talmud. How so? Under which circumstances may one disregard a lost item? One may do so in a case where he was a priest and the lost item is in the graveyard. For example, there's a case, a priest, a Kohen is not allowed to become impure. So what happens if I see my fellow's donkey is in the graveyard? So should I go in and return the lost item? I'm not allowed to, because I can't defile myself. I can't become impure. I'm a priest. So therefore, it says, ignore them. That's what the verse says, ignore. It doesn't really say it. But at least the way we're reading it, it says, we have other examples. Or where he was an elderly person and it is not in keeping with his dignity to tend to the item. Or where the value of his labor was greater than the value of the lost item to the other person. I.e., if the finder was to return the item, reimbursing him for his lost wages would cost more than the value of the item. I find an item I found a chicken. Chicken in the market costs $6. It's going to take me an hour to return the chicken to the owner. Now, if I'm a lawyer and I make $400 an hour, then I'm going to go to the guy and say, here's your chicken, but reimburse me for my time. So now the guy took a loss of $396. So that case, you could ignore. You have to return your lost item, but not at the expense of your own lost wages. So we have a whole list of cases, says the Talmud, the Kach Nemar, therefore it is stated, and disregard them. Now, it doesn't really say disregard them, right? It's only if you're doing this Talmudic trick of reading the second clause of verse 1 as its own standalone clause. It's a trick. I don't know, it's a trick. That's the way we learn. Fine. So that's for that. Vicky has a question. We'll take Vicky's question, and then we'll get to what I really want to get to, which is the Hasidic interpretation, a Kabbalistic. It's not Hasidic, it's pre-Hasidic, it's from the Alshich, but the Kabbalistic interpretation of this play on you cannot ignore, you will ignore, you should ignore, and hopefully we'll tie it to the entirety of the Parsha. But first, we'll take Vicky's question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rabbi. I don't know if it's a good time for it. First of all, thank you for bringing up the Talmudic examples, because it really highlights that the self-respect comes first. Otherwise, nothing's going to work.
Yeah,
But
human dignity. Very interesting. What's more important, a dollar or dignity? Very
Right.
interesting. Talmud is a term called kavod habriot, which is the honor, dignity of people. And some cases we say the dignity of people is more important than a biblical commandment. In some cases, so it's certainly something that the Talmud is very sensitive to.
But my actual question was about something that you said at the very beginning about Amalek. Maybe I'll save it for later. But the question was about the how to spot Amalek, because it says remember Amalek who attacked the weaklings,
Yeah.
and then the clause concludes because he didn't fear God. So there is a clear connection between how they treat the weak people and they didn't fear God. So maybe because we don't have a Amalek like a nation now, maybe that's a good test how to spot a
Right.
spark of Amalek in somebody. So, but that you save it for later.
Let's do that for a minute. Yeah, let's do that for a minute. So now let's go back to the lost item. Well, I'll get back to that in a minute. Let's go back to the lost item. We see, at least in the way the Talmud reads it, is that there's a way to read in the beginning. Lo tirei, you shouldn't see ox's donkey going astray, and you should ignore them, return them. And if your brother is distant and you don't know where he is, bring him into your house, and it will be with you until your brother seeks it out, and then return it. How long was it with you? I don't know. Could be a month, could be a year, could be 10 years, right? Remember, we're talking about travel wasn't so simple in Talmud in biblical times. So theoretically, the stories in the Talmud where somebody found a few chickens, and then by the time the owner came back, it was already there's a whole story there with it. It became a herd of goats because he was keep raising the chickens, and chickens is too much effort, too expensive to raise chickens over time. So he sold too much work. So he sold the chickens, bought goats. Goats were grazing the field, and they come back. You know the story. Know the story? The Talmudic story like this. The story is that once upon a time, a guy was walking down the street, and a rabbi, I forget, I don't know if it says the rabbi's name. Maybe it does. The rabbi comes outside, and he sees that a guy left chickens by his door by mistake of someone traveling by, but there was a sign, there was a siman, and according to the Talmud, if there's this identifying mark, you have to return it. So he brings the chickens into the house. So for 30 days, he's raising the chickens. The chickens lay eggs. Before you knew it was his full-time job that he was raising these chickens that didn't belong to him. So the Talmud says you only have to do it 30 days. After 30 days, you sell it and you hold the money. But this guy didn't do that. He's going to go beyond the letter of the law. So he sold the chickens, bought goats. And the logic was goats, it's much easier to raise. It's not labor intensive. They graze in the field. They come back by themselves. And this herd of goats are growing and growing, and they come back. And this guy has the stable for all these goats. So it's not labor intensive, but I guess there still is a cost. Years and years later, the guy who dropped the chickens comes back. It was walking back the same road. And he says, 10 years ago, I think I left my chickens here. So he knocks on the closest door, and he says, you have my chicken. Have you seen chickens here? So he says, yeah, come back in the evening. I'll give you back your chickens. Okay. So he goes to the market, comes back, goes to Shul to learn. I don't know where he goes, comes back in the evening. He says, where's my chickens? He says, come outside. So he goes outside. He says, you see that toward the horizon, you see all those, you see in the distance here. What do you see? I see herds and herds of donkeys. He says, those are your chickens. And they gave it back. So the point here is that if you take this seriously, it could take a lot of effort. Says the holy Alshich. He was a great Kabbalist in Tzfat. He's buried with all the other Kabbalists in the old cemetery in Tzfat. He lived in the great times of the Arizal and the Beit Yosef, and he was part of the Kabbalistic Renaissance in Tzfat in the 1500s. He says like this. He says, what is the Torah telling? In the beginning of the Torah, of the verse, represents the beginning of a Jew's struggle to do the right thing. And what happens is you see your brother's donkey. What's your first instinct when I see my brother's donkey? I'm looking at the donkey, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to have to take care of this thing. So what's my instinct? My instinct is I ignore them. I see myself, I look the other way. And the Torah has to come and say, don't see your brother's donkey and do what you really want to do, which is look the other way. Don't do that, because you have to do the right thing. But it's a struggle. Then you read verse 2. And verse 2 says, if your brothers, let's read it inside. Verse 2 says, I don't remember, I have bad memory, so I'm going to read it inside. Verse 2 says, if your brother is distant, is not near you, or if you do not know him, you shall bring it into your house, and it shall be with you until your brother seeks it out, whereupon you shall return it to him. This could be a long time. This guy is now for years, or for a certain amount of time, he's investing in doing the mitzvah. Says the Alshaf, that changes you. When you engage in a good deed, it changes you. It changes your character over time. And here comes the beauty. Verse 3, and excuse me because I'm going to change this horrible translation. Let's see if the Art Scroll also made the Art Scroll also made this horrible translation. Verse 3, so shall you do with his donkey, so shall you do with his garment, and so shall you do with any lost article of your brother, which he has lost and you have found. Anyone know Hebrew here? Please look at verse 3 in the Hebrew. So it's the last line of the Hebrew on page 1048. Last 3 words of the verse. What does it say? Lo tuchal lehitalem. What does this mean? What's the translation? Lo tuchal. Amy's right. You cannot ignore it. What does it mean you cannot ignore it? So they translate it, you shall not hide yourself. You shall not ignore, right? Or here, you shall not ignore it. It's not what it says. Lo tuchal lehitalem. You cannot ignore it. Once you engage in the mitzvah, you are changed. Your character changes. Your sensitivity changes. Your value system changes. And therefore, in the beginning, the Torah had to say, don't do what you naturally want to do and ignore your fellow's lost object. If you engage in the mitzvah, and again, we assume it took some time, it took some effort, now you're transformed to the point that you cannot ignore. And I think that this is a beautiful interpretation about doing mitzvot at all, and in general. It's not just an external action, but the external action actually changes you. But I think it's also a commentary on this entire parsha, because we want to say, what's Parshas Ki Teise? It really gives you mitzvahs for every area of life. There's no area of life in this parsha that's not covered, and not spiritual areas. How to borrow money and lend money, how to raise agriculture, etc., how to hire an employee, etc. Every area of life is addressed in this week's parsha. And what is the parsha telling you? Parsha is God gives us so many mitzvot, but it's not just to keep us busy, to keep our actions engaged. The engaging in the mitzvah transforms me of a person who initially, and maybe in the beginning of the parsha, I seek to take advantage of somebody else, or later on, at least I seek to ignore, not to cause damage, I seek to ignore the other's pain or the other person's loss. But after engaging in the mitzvah, I am transformed. I am a person who could no longer ignore. So lo tuchal is not the way they translated it is as you shall not. Torah is hinting you, it means that as well. You shall not ignore. It's a negative commandment. But the Torah writes it in a way that literally it means you cannot ignore. So the Torah is telling you what's going to happen when you do the mitzvah. When you keep engaging in mitzvot, your nature transforms. You're a person who cannot ignore. You cannot ignore the other person. And that's the transformation that happens through this mitzvah, but through all the mitzvot. And that's the beautiful message of Ki Teise. And of course, we can go through all 74 commandments that will be here forever. So come back next year, same time, same place, in good health. And we will continue on our journey through the 74 mitzvot of Ki Teise. Vicky's question, how do you recognize who Amalek is? Short answer is, I don't know. Practically speaking, we cannot. In other words, to find someone and say, you are the embodiment of Amalek, and therefore I have to do to you what I have to do with Amalek, which is wipe you out, men, women, and children, that we cannot do.
You're supposed to remember.
Oh, Seth says you're supposed to remember, which means,
Wait.
yeah.
You're supposed to remember. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think this is.
Yeah,
how I think.
Go ahead.
You're supposed to remember that if you don't do the mitzvah, how you're going to feel and how it's going, in other words, you're weak if you don't do the mitzvah, and so Amalek is going to attack you. If you do the mitzvah, in spite of how you feel, you're going to be stronger, and Amalek won't have a chance to go after.
That's very good. That's very good. So you have what fortifies you spiritually
Right.
is that you are connected to God. You're
And even
doing
if you overcome it where you're an old person, if you do it anyway.
right.
You reverse your age.
Then you can't. Yeah. You become young. Yeah, young is in there.
That's how I think.
Yeah,
about it.
that's very good. That's very good.
Yeah, that actually what I was going to say, because we don't have Amalek as a nation or even as a person, but the traits, the tendencies.
Yeah. So
And
the
also,
characteristics of
and
Amalek, in other
also
words,
the
it's-
connection between doing something bad to other people and not fearing
Yeah,
God.
so let's talk about this for a second. I'm just going to address both points. It's already 11:04. I'll give me 20 seconds for each. Number one is there are characteristics of Amalek, the ones who attack the vulnerable. That is something that the Torah says, that's Amalek characteristics. We can't tolerate that. In biblical times, with Amalek means go to war, wipe out men, women, and children. Today, we're not going to do that in the figurative sense, in the literal sense, but in the figurative sense, we have to wipe that out completely. That's something we cannot make peace with. And somebody taking advantage of the vulnerable. And this week's parsha, there are many examples of people who take advantage of the vulnerable, the poor, and also the widow, the orphan, people who don't have, in that society, if you're a widow or orphan, you didn't have a base of support. And the Torah talks about how things that a regular creditor could do, you cannot do for the poor, and you cannot do for a widow and orphan. So there's a lot about protecting the vulnerable. But somebody who will specifically come out and attack the most vulnerable in society, that's the character of Amalek. In biblical days, we went to war literally. Today, we go to war figuratively. We cannot tolerate any of that. That's point number one. Point number two, because they don't fear God. Already Shamshin Fall Hirsch and others talk about this, and they say, love your fellow as yourself. Everyone knows that verse. What do people not realize? It reminds me, I said this every time, but it reminds me of, everyone knows that the verse says, Moshe comes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go. Everyone, most famous verse, one of the most famous verses in the Bible, let my people go. But what the continuation of the verse is, and let them serve me in the desert. That no one ever heard of. In other words, we want freedom so we could serve God. No one ever heard of that. So similarly, love your fellow as yourself. Wonderful. So humanistic. What's the end of the verse? Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. What does love your fellow as yourself have anything to do with I am the Lord? So Shamshin Fall here says, why do you love your fellow as yourself? Because I am the Lord, because every person has the image of God within themselves. Every person was created in the image of God. So if you recognize that every person is created in the image of God, then you will love your fellow as yourself. So what we're saying from the Jewish perspective, if you don't respect the image of God, which is a human being, then you're going to take advantage of the person who's weaker. Then it's a jungle. If it's jungle, that's what you do. You prey on the weak. You watch the National Geographic videos. It's like a shame. It's like a lion. It's horrible. Why are you going after? My mother told me, don't, start with someone your own size. Why do they go after the weakest guy in the herd? Because they're afraid of the big one, so they go after the small one. That's jungle. That's for them. It's okay, but for a human being, that's Amalek. That's because you don't respect the Ani Hashem, the I'm the Lord, you're not in awe of God and the spirit of God which is in the person. So Amalek, ultimately, you think what he's doing is he's taking advantage of a person, but that's the symptom. The root is lo yirei Elokim, is not God-fearing. Because if you're God-fearing and you have respect for God, then you have respect for the image of God, which is every person. So that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to say the story in short because it's not, but that is wetting our tongues or getting our feet wet, depending on which metaphor you like, in the waters of the Parsha. And that's it. It's just wetting the palate so we can continue studying on our own.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.